We're muted. Is everybody muted? Can you talk in? Good, I think we're muted. Bonnie, would you like to introduce? You want to just begin the presentation tonight?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
So I just want to welcome everybody to our second teleseminar, Beyond Horror and Hope. And this is an archetypal and depth psychological look, of course, at the Sandy Hook, Connecticut school shootings. And I'm just really thrilled to be here with you, Michael. Of course, many of you know Dr. Michael Conforti, who has done such really profound and powerful work in the area of archetypal pattern analysis, and to be able to really look at what's going on with various events and things that are happening whenever we have something of this magnitude that happens, as well as with events of all different levels of impact. And, of course, many of you know me as well. My name is Bonnie Bright, and I'm the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance. And we have over 1,800 members. It's an online community for everyone who's interested in depth psychology. And very excited about some of the things we have coming up there. So I also wanted to mention, because I did not do that last week, and that is that there is an ongoing discussion on Depth Psychology Alliance about the Sandy Hook school shootings. And that would be an excellent place to go if you want to participate in kind of a written forum for some of the follow-up discussion and to stay abreast of what's happening with these teleseminars, and also just to connect with your peers in something that's so traumatic and so tragic. But again, thanks to all of you for making the time to join us here, or who are listening later. I know the holidays are a very busy time, and it really means something that you are willing to take your time to participate in this and to really witness and share with us in attempting to make some kind of meaning of all of this. So, Michael, thanks again for being with us, and really appreciate your time. Why don't you go ahead?
You're welcome. And thank you so much, Bonnie. And, a couple of things I want to say is, one thing is I'm going to have to ask you to bear with me. I've had this miserable flu for like 4 days, and I'm at the tail end of it right now, but my voice is really not good. And if I just disappear in the middle of a sentence, it's because I'm coughing my brains out. So just, like I say, bear with me, and I apologize for any inconvenience. And I'm going to pick up the other phone. Hold on one second. It's a better reception. Okay.
Michael, while you're doing that, I'll just remind everyone that if you have questions at any point during the discussion, you're welcome to raise your hands if you're listening by telephone. And, of course, to raise your hand, you can press *2, and we'll see that on the computer, and we'll be able to call on you. And if you're listening online, there's a section to the left of your screen which will allow you to actually type in a question and send it to us.
Thank you. And in terms of format, Bonnie and I spoke about what we want to do tonight, and we're going to maybe combine, we're going to speak for about half an hour, and then we want to open up to the group for at least half an hour, because I know there are a lot of questions, a lot of emotions that are coming up around all this, and we want to do our best to respond and create a forum, as Bonnie said in the opening, for some discussion, a meaningful discussion, because it's clear the Jungian perspective and archetypal perspective offers a very different way of looking at these events. Never making it impersonal, non-personal, but to understand what could be the driving force of these behaviors. And as a part of an opening, I would say that I think it's important that we don't eclipse the eternal by focusing on the temporal. And what I mean by that is we should look at all the temporal events. Dr. Scarcella made a very important point last week. A very, very gifted psychoanalyst from Rome. They're living in the D.C. area. Wonderful, wonderful woman. When she talked about the need to understand the origins of these cases, and it's a point well made that we need to look at the origins, the history, the family dynamics. As neuropsychology is telling us right now about the neurobiological blueprint of the mind of psychopaths and serial killers, that's something very different, and we need to continue doing that. And I'm saying, in addition to that, I hope that was clear last week. In addition, what I feel Jung brings to the table is both a recognition of the temporal events, but a recognition and a deep, deep regard for the ontological, which is the field out of which these experiences happen. So that is my preamble. I want to begin with a little story. I want to thank a colleague, Sylvia Barons, who reminded me of a wonderful book. Sylvia's out. I think she may be on tonight or listening later. She's from Olympia. About a book that, probably the most important book I've ever read in my life, called The Accident by Elie Wiesel. And it's a story about somebody who's trying to make a life after the aftermath of the Holocaust. How one can do that, no one knows. How do these families in Sandy Hook make a life afterwards? I have absolutely no idea. And I actually have a good friend who's a psychologist down in Danbury. I'm going to give her a call and talk to her about this. I mean, you never really put your life back together. But anyway, in the book, towards the end of it, after many, many agonizing pages of Wiesel, he paints his portrait of a character. It's autobiographical, but he never says so, of course. That's the way he writes in many of these novels. It's a character that says, look, I'm with the dead. I'm with my past. The dead never leave the living, and the dead never keep the promises. But we stay wedded to the old world. And a friend comes by in one of the last scenes, and he sees a portrait of Elie Wiesel's, I think, a grandmother. And he says, every time I look at this picture, I feel so sad. And the man in this, I think it's a big Hungarian artist, says, well, burn the picture. Burn it. He said, that's a good idea. We'll burn it. I don't think so, but let's burn it. So we burn it. And after they burn it, the man says, you feel better? And the character, Elie Wiesel, says, but the ashes are still there. Yet the ashes remain. And that's going to be the opening, really, what I want to talk about tonight. And that, hopefully that's a meaningful metaphor or takeaway, at least from my part of this presentation for people tonight, that the ashes remain. History abounds with stories of atrocities. Atrocities from greed to rape to pillage to genocide to you name it. I mean, from being done by the hands of the religious to the hands of the infidels to whomever. It's a part of human history. And I made a comment last week citing one of the old Jungian analysts, Liliana Frey-Ron, and she made a very important comment when she said, and I'll paraphrase it from last week, she said, what happens in the unconscious, in the deep unconscious, is that there are contents there. There are personal contents and archetypal contents. Especially when the archetypal contents get stronger and stronger, and there's no healthy means of expression for those contents, they begin blowing over the banks. And we've had that in Brattleboro recently, where there were floodings here last year. I know Portland, Oregon's had a lot of flooding in many places, and you really see when the water just rises. New York, my father's on the phone. Staten Island was demolished, basically, from the floods. When the banks don't hold and the waters just get higher and higher and they spread out all over the place. And what she's saying in that article is that this is what happens to the contents of the unconscious. And as they begin to spread out their tentacles and spread out their hands and their fingers by claiming more and more land, even if it's just temporarily, like a tsunami, what's happening at those points is it's the power of the unconscious which is taken over. And I said, that's what we're seeing with the Sandy Hook shooting. Because the Sandy Hook shooting, again, not to eclipse the eternal for the temporal, it's an event that's part of a series of events. And I wish we couldn't say that, but I think we have to say it. Yes, to the families involved, it's the only event that matters. And I'm sure we all get on our knees and we say, thank you so much, it wasn't my child. It wasn't my loved ones. It wasn't my grandkids. We have to say that if we're real. And I remember reading a piece of Elie Wiesel when he said at one point, when he said, God must have loved you, that's why you survived. And he took umbrage. He said, does that mean God didn't love all the ones that died? So I can't say, well, God, thank God that our kids survived it, but they did survive it, and we're thankful. But the point now is, what is it? What can we take away from a Jungian perspective on an event as unimaginable as the Sandy Hook shootings, the horror and the hope? And I think Liliana Frey-Ron puts her fingers on it when she talks about something erupting, something getting so strong that it's overflowing. And we just heard, I think in the past week, there were two more events, one successful, relatively successful, terrible language, another one that was stopped. They found a kid and people called the authorities on him, and they thwarted another effort of a school shooting. So what I want to address now is what I think is the content. Now, I'm putting myself on the line here, so here goes. If you look at stories from the beginning of time, from biblical to Hasidic stories to Christian to Buddhist, you name it, not so much Buddhist, but more of the Judeo-Christian stories, and you look at human history, from Asian to every culture, from the beginning of time there has been violence and war. There has been bloodlust. And a colleague, I remember he was on the call today, Alan, God, I can't remember his last name right now. My head's a little bit of a fog. Well, I'll think of it later. He's writing a book on bloodlust. And how many sports have we had with this? Modern day football is another one of them. Boxing's another one. Wrestling's another one. We're in the heart of hearts of all the spectators. They're waiting to hear the bones break. Now, I remember I go to Italy every year to teach for about the past 20 years, and the first 10 years my son came with me every year, and we'd go do the tours in Rome and in Naples and all, which I love doing. And I had seen the Colosseum many years ago, and I took my son back to see it a couple of years ago, and I said, Chris, I almost can't stay here. I want to leave. I said, why, Daddy? I said, can you feel something? He's also very, very psychically sensitive. And he said, yeah, I do feel something. I said, I can't put my finger on it. I said, well, Chris, let's leave. Let's go get some lunch, or if we can eat whatever. And I said, I just feel the senseless brutality that took place here for how many years? How many thousands of lives were slaughtered in the name of spectator sports? To feed the something of the emperors. And we know only too well stories of Caligula and others. And again, whether they had brain disease, and they now say Caligula was one of these most destructive of emperors, they had a brain disease. They had found it now. But whatever it is, people would go. Regular people like you and I, take our families and bring out lunch. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Do the Christians live? Does the guy who's fighting it, does that warrior live or die? Now, I remember we were talking with people in a 2-year program a number of months ago. It was one of these wonderful discussions where you knew you're in the domain of the profound. And I said, oh my God, are we talking about the fact that humanity has struggled since the beginning of time to find an arena for the domain of the violence, for the domain of the brutal in life? Because it ain't going to go away. And yet the ashes remain, right? It's not going to go away. I mean, survival is not always a pretty thing. Let's be real about it. I mean, if you ever watch those animal shows, when they bring down the antelope, or bring down the old moose or whatever, and they tear it to shreds. That's part of human nature, and that's real. However, I think what's happening, and I think what's happened since the beginning of time, is that we haven't found a place to acknowledge. And I remember, and I want to acknowledge a colleague, a very, very gifted Jungian analyst. Some of you know Manisha Roy from Boston. Originally from India, she was an anthropologist and became a Jungian. And many years ago, we were having dinner, and we're talking about hunting. I'm going back probably 20 years now, or more, 25 years ago. And I said, I can't take hunting. I can't see it. And she said, Michael, it's part of human nature. We've hunted since the beginning of time. It's a way for us to express that part of our nature. And I got it. I got it in a way I never did before. And now I fish, and you see that you can say it's just a slaughter when you see the fish brought on board and all that. It can be a slaughter if it's not done with reverence and respect. But I think what's happening is that I don't think we found a container that fits. And going back to the quote I gave from Eric Neumann last week about suppression. Suppression and repression. Remember, suppression is you intentionally, I'm going to not do this, I'm not going to hunt, I'm not going to this. Repression is you don't even think about it because you hate it so much. It's out of your mind. The more you repress a content, the more it's going to spring up somewhere behind you. And I think much of our religious orientations, many of our religious orientations, and our cultural orientations are oriented around the abolishment or the calming of the demonic forces in the psyche. You know what, though? It's not going to work. They're going to be until we find some way of making sense of this stuff. And yes, we need to look at the families because clearly certain conditions generate this. You want to watch an incredible movie? Watch the movie The Boys from Brazil, where they cloned Hitler's DNA, I think it was, or his chromosomes, whatever, and they put him in 9 or 10 kids all over the world, and they recreated the conditions of his birth. And it's a bizarre movie, but it's eerie. And they created Hitler's, you know. So you know there are conditions that create this stuff. If some of you know the work of Philip Zimbardo, he's the guy from the Stanford experiments. Remember the famous thing where they put the kids in one dorm? They were all good friends. He made one half the prison guards, one half the prisoners, and the kids took on the roles. So I think we talked about that last week alone. So the point is, there are conditions. There are, to use my word, there are fields that create phenomena, fields that generate form. And I think when we understand that no amount of cultural, religious, what can we say, legalistic, nothing is really going to really put the lid on these kind of phenomena. I think it's great we're looking for gun control. I mean, I think it's horrible with the guns that's going on. There's no question. I think we're all probably in agreement with these assault weapons. Give me a break. 50 shots every 2 seconds or 50 bullets every half a minute. It's insane. And the hunters are saying, who needs it, But again, the issue is, why would one buy it? There's some deep, deep need in the human psyche to be related to it. You know how much money wrestling makes as a profession, boxing makes as a profession, football makes as a profession. Now you can say, well, is Conforti saying these things are all the same as serial killer? No. What I'm saying is I think there is a similar base. It's the need for human aggression and violence. Until it finds an arena, and until it is understood as part of the human condition, we're going to remain in the state we're in right now. And I'm not trying to be prophetic about it. And add one more piece to this. Is, any time, well, let's go back to one of the stories. Do you know the image of peace in the Christian faith? It's when the lion and the lamb sleeps together. And Henry Kissinger was brought over to Israel one time. And took him to the zoo. And he said, oh my God, you have a lion and a lamb in the zoo, in the cage here, in the same cage. And he said, this is the image of peace for the Christian, so it must be true. Right? And he's flabbergasted. And he says to the zookeeper, how do you do it? He says, well, we change the lamb every day. In some ways, you're to have it as an image of peace, you're asking something to change its ontological makeup, the archetypal makeup. Yes, it happens, and we hear stories occasionally of one prey mothering the predator's babies or something, or the predator, we hear some of these wonderful stories. They're still more rare, because when left to one's own devices, there are these other instincts. Now, I'm not trying to say that the nature of the human condition is base and vile and cruel and all. I'm not trying to say that. But I'm saying it, and I made this point last week, that if you look at the human condition, we have both, the beautiful, the benevolence, and we also have the malevolence. This is why from Jung to Desjardins to all the great scholars and from the beginning of time, all of the great biblical pieces, they always talk about the difference and the relation between heaven and hell. And in one of the most secret of the Jewish texts, there's a wonderful story when the devil came up to God. And he said, God, look, you're getting all the action right now. Everyone wants to be next to you. They don't want to be near me, the devil, anymore. It's not fair. We need to have equal competition on the streets here. And God said, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let you dress up and let some of the other devils dress up as God. And people won't know the difference for a while. And it's another one of these striking images that a lot of times we don't know the difference between what's God and the people that are fighting. I'm sure when this kid did what he did, he believed on some level he was doing what was right. Bin Laden believed he was doing what was right. And you can't talk to anybody when they're possessed. But what I'm suggesting here is, in addition to looking at the biological, in addition to looking at the psychological, to look at the ontological, to say, where do they really go? Where is that place in human nature that we visited on so many occasions throughout the eons, from the beginning of time? That's one piece. The next piece I want to talk about very briefly, I'm going to hand this over to Bonnie then, is there more that we could do? Okay? And I'm sure we're all asking that question. In our own communities, in our schools, in our families, And how many times have we all said, I knew that one was a little bit strange. I knew that kid was weird. I never liked that one. And, I never wanted that one around my kids or whatever. Well, and this is also going to be a little tough note. The difference between profiling and pattern recognition is pattern recognition looks at the history. Okay? Profiling looks at the general picture, the general impressions. Puerto Rican, Italian, Cuban, whatever, okay? Afro-American. Pattern looks at the individual. So profiling looks at the general features and just the racial features and all that. Pattern recognition and pattern analysis looks at the individual features. And when you begin to look at many of these cases, and I began broaching this theme last week, and you find that many of these kids or these killers have a huge history. This means there's something that we have done or something that we have not done appropriately. When you find that this one kid, say you got 500 kids in the school system, excuse me, and you find 10, every kid has a little manila folder, right? And then they're all about, an eighth of an inch thick, okay, with reports and counselors. And then you get these 10 kids with a file that's about 4 inches thick. You got a story. Now, maybe the 4 inches thick because they got all awards for basketball or for gymnastics or for dance or scholarship. Could be. But the point is, and this is where Jung's work again was so brilliant with the word association test, he looked at those situations that were complexed, right? What word evoked the most difficult response? Mother, father, sister, brother, car. Oh, God, car. I don't know, car. I can't think of response. And he would see that those words that generated the most powerful response were those words that had an emotional complex around it. It's the same here with pattern recognition. When you begin to realize that these kids that have these 4 to 6, 8 inch files here, there's a story. And I'm not saying that we're going to take them out and, we're not going to subject them to eugenics and all that kind of thing. It's not the issue. But I do think it's attendant upon a culture to say, let's talk. Let's talk here. Because there's a story. And then there are actions. Like the psychiatrist, I think the Middle Eastern psychiatrist, I think it was in Texas, that went on the rampage and shot some of the people out there. All the reports came out afterward that everyone knew that this guy was out of his mind. They knew he was violent. They saw the potential for violence was off the charts with this guy. No one wanted to act on it. And again, what it hits us is with a lot of our ideas of it's all going to be better. Everyone deserves a second chance. And I'll finish this one story. A number of years ago, an attorney came he was working with the courts in a particular state. I don't name what states or whatever. And he said, I want to study with you, Dr. Conforti. I want to study your work on pattern analysis. And he said for years he was compiling secret records from the courts on cases of child abuse. And this is a true story, okay? That's why when you hear details, you're going to know why I don't want to mention names or even states. They were secret details of all the court cases of child abuse with families. I mean, what kid was thrown down the stairs, what kid had their arm broken, what kid was burned, what kid had their face put up against the radiator, whatever. And he said in almost every one of these cases, even first and second offense, you know what the judges said? I think we need a cooling off period for the parents. Let the parents cool off. Give a couple of weeks of therapy, a couple of child parenting classes, and they'll be fine. And he would watch, and he had all of his records there, and they come back third and fourth and fifth time until it got worse. And he said, Michael, I can give you the proof you're looking for this stuff. Now, look, repetition is nature's way of conserving behavioral patterns. Repetition is nature's way of conserving archetypal patterns. When we find repetition, we know that there's a certain groove that the individual is living in, that there's a certain patternicity or periodicity to the life. The more the life begins to settle around a certain focal point, it does demand that we take some action. At least we address it, and you offer somebody counseling, and you talk to them. Now, of course, there are going to be cases where there's not a lot of history, like this kid didn't have a lot of history. But, I mean, can you imagine going back to the families and saying, well, we knew there was a lot of trouble, but we just didn't do anything? And you tell that to a family that lost their kid? How do you do it? At least if you can say, we did our best, we're sorry beyond words for what happened. And I can never imagine what you've been through. And at least we did what we could. We saw there was writing on the wall. We didn't know what the end point was going to be. We didn't want to make predictions. But you know what? There was enough evidence that suggested that this was a thing in the making. And I'll leave you with one little piece, and then we'll turn it over to Bonnie. I remember when my son was playing baseball. Yeah, he was going to Catholic school for a while. And there was one kid that was always very strong and very, very tough. Not my boy. My boy, he's to this day, he's 6 feet tall and 130 pounds. He looks like a tall Kenyan track runner. He's a track star. But anyway, I said to Chris, I said, don't go near that guy. I mean, he'll break you in half, Chris. Thank God you're fast. Run. Get out of there. Get out of Dodge real quick. Anyway, one day when they had a practice, they were on the same baseball team together. This boy took one of the girls on the team too, boys and girls. And he took one of the girls and threw her up against the, what do they call it, the dugout wall. He literally took her and threw her against it. And of course he reprimanded and everything, but I said to myself, this kid's seen this before. He did it with that cold look that goes into a killer's eyes before an event like that. And my son went to high school with this kid, and he said, Dad, he's always in the violence. I said, you stay away, Christopher. He will break you in a heartbeat. He'll break your back in a heartbeat. Literally break your back. Stay away. If he wants your money, give him your money. I don't care. I'll pay you back. And this kid's been no end of trouble since the age of 3 all the way up to today. Now, this is a kid that did see it. He saw it, like Dr. Scacciello's comments. And I'm sure Dr. Scacciello will be a fabulous analyst for this boy, this young man now, in his 20s. He saw the violence growing up. He saw the hatred of a father beating the mother. And you never get over that. I think we all know that. Now, where does some healing come in with this? Healing, the only place for healing that comes in with this is if somebody can listen to the unimaginable stories these people have. If they're not listened to or given ear or given voice, the waters are going to build up and they're going to overflow. And I think in many ways that we're drawn to this work. Bonnie's got 1,800 people now. We've got tons of people in our community. I think we all have a certain moral obligation, not missionary obligation is not the point, but a certain obligation if you could see certain things. And I've been looking at some of the websites of people that are signing up for this. There are many, many high-powered people, executives signing up for this. People that run counseling centers, people that run centers for violence and domestic violence, children's violence. I got a call the other day from someone that said the president's main person may be calling you because they're interested in your work on this. I said, well, let them call. I'd love to have a conversation. They may call in anonymously on the phone call. I said, well, let them call, But the point is, let's have a dialogue. Because I think what Bonnie and I are really trying to do, and Bonnie speak for herself, but what I see us trying to do is open an arena to look at the temporal as an expression of the eternal. Not to exclude or to eclipse the bigger issue. Yes, go for gun control. Yes, go for psychiatric evaluation. Yes, therapy. Yes, all that stuff. And also, I feel from the bottom of my heart, you also got to ask the question, where is it one goes when they go into those domains? It's not personal. And that's one of the major points. And last week, I got to admit, it was the most difficult presentation I gave in my life last week. The most difficult. Because there's so many people coming from so many different perspectives. And I wanted to be more cautious what I said. And tonight I feel like, I could be much more relaxed about it. And, so I'd say what I wanted to say. So, Bonnie, over to you.
Well, thank you, Michael. You've just laid such a beautiful groundwork for yet another conversation that could last hours, if not days and weeks. And I do hope that this conversation will continue, not only amongst all of us here in the community the greater depth psychology community, but also, in your own homes, at your dinner tables, at your organizations that you're part of. And it's just such a critical piece of this to actually be able to have the discussion about it, as you mentioned, Michael. And, part of that is actually having some kind of a container in which we can sort of turn these things over and begin to look at the reality of what it is that we're dealing with here. I know a lot of what we are looking at on the surface level. Of course, one of the definitions of depth psychology is that it's a study of the unconscious. And so if we only look at the things that are obvious on the surface level, we're never going to be able to get to the point of what it is that is really valuable and is wanting to be manifest here. This whole idea of flooding, Michael, and the unconscious contents which are coming up and washing literally over the dikes and the walls of whatever kind of container we've put around ourselves to try and protect ourselves, it's never going to work. It's never going to be enough, as you pointed out. We are going to have to dig in, and we are going to have to, especially those of us who are willing, to be able to do something about it and take some kind of action. Now, I noticed there are a lot of questions coming in, by the way, from people who have been writing in, and I just wanted to thank each of you who have submitted those questions, and also want to encourage you to go online, particularly the Alliance, again, because we already have a conversation and a forum going there, but anywhere, go online and post those questions somewhere where a group of people can see them and can have an opportunity to respond, because, what Michael and I are bringing here are a handful of facets of ways to look at this thing, and there are a million more. There's never going to be one lens or one way to look at this. What is important, of course, is that we are looking at it. And I think what I would really like to just bring tonight, maybe more than anything, is these shootings are really a symptom of something. What we're seeing are the contents that are washing up over those protective walls that we've created in our culture. And I think the fact that this particular event, the Sandy Hook school shooting, has really galvanized our nation is because we have a cultural complex around it. There's something going on in our culture collectively that we are not looking at and that needs to be dealt with before it erupts even more and more. And, of course, we are seeing that happening. And, I don't want to discount the other events that have taken place, even this week, as Michael mentioned, the firefighters in Pennsylvania.
Oh, my God, horrible story.
I know. And yet, I think already I feel myself sort of becoming immune to that in a way, because it's like you just expect it. You know that there's going to be more. And as horrible as it is, how do you begin? And this was yet another question that somebody asked here online, and that is, how do you even begin to protect yourself against the horror? Particularly, there are so many of us here on the call and in the community that are therapists and are trying to help other people deal with these kinds of things. And somebody mentioned, Sharon Knight, thank you so much for your question. You mentioned this whole idea about dealing with things as an individual, and of course, Jung really put that forward, that we really have to begin with ourselves, and that the attitude of the individual can bring about the renewal, and it can also bring about a renewal in the spirit of nations. And so, again, we're looking a lot at the symptoms, and I think gun control is a way of dealing with the symptom. And I don't know how many of you saw this this story. It came out literally almost the next day after the Sandy Hook shooting, and that was that sales of inserts, bulletproof inserts that go into children's backpacks had skyrocketed 300% within a day or two of that shooting. And I saw this section on, I think it was on CNN actually, and they were showing these backpack inserts that could be shot and would protect a child if these were put inside their backpack. And they were printed with, pink Disney princesses and superhero cartoons for the boys. And I think what we're doing is we're dealing with symptoms with more symptoms. We're not actually going to the heart of what's going on here. And I made some reference last week to this article that I had read by Glenn Slater, who is a Jungian and had written an article called The Mythology of Bullets. Again, I highly recommend that. It appeared in the spring number 81 issue of the Spring Journal. And I have that reference online in that conversation if you want to look that up and find out more about it. But what he was talking about a lot was this idea that we are not able to deal with this feeling of not having power in our culture. And what that comes down to for me, of course, is this whole sense of marginalization. And it's no secret that every one of these people who have committed these kinds of acts felt clearly marginalized in some way. And as you know, and you can imagine, if you've never experienced that to a great extent, it can be such a painful and traumatic experience. And it does lead to states of despair and to altered states, to dissociation, and also a burning desire for revenge of some sort. And it's no secret that these people who are feeling marginalized are, these are the contents of the unconscious in one aspect that may be rushing up to the surface and overriding those walls and those barriers, Michael, as you mentioned. But your image of the ashes, and last week you mentioned the shoes of all of the Holocaust survivors that are piled in the Holocaust Museum, and I've seen that in Prague myself, and it's just absolutely devastating. And I understand the correlation that you're making between that image and what we're dealing with here today, because on a symbolic level, it's there are no varying levels of this. It's just a tragedy, and it's just horrific on every level. By the way, you mentioned Sylvia Berend, who had just written the book. She posted a really nice blog on depthpsychologylist.com, where she actually posted an image of those shoes and wrote a piece of poetry in response to what you said last week, Michael. And so I recommend that you guys go check that out if you have a chance and see her blog. At any rate, I was wondering when you were talking tonight about this need for aggression, this bloodlust that is inherent not only in us individually but in our culture and has built up over millennia, and on so many levels it's just so embedded in us that there's how do we counter that? What is it that enables us to counter that? And one thing that occurred to me is this idea of reflection and self-reflection. If we don't have the capacity to be reflective, then we don't have the capacity to ever get below the surface level of what's going on here and to be able to actually do some kind of an analysis or observation of what it is that we're dealing with. I think that we are not really seeing people in our society, and that goes for myself too. This is very much a cultural milieu, and I'll just share this incident with you. This week, actually, I was walking on a very busy street, and there was a huge crash, and two cars just smashed into each other as one car was trying to cross a really busy intersection that didn't have a stoplight in it. And I heard the crash. I happened to have just walked past the intersection, so I didn't see it, but it was probably 30 feet away from me, and it was very busy, holiday shoppers all around. There must have been 40 or 50 people kind of just on the sidewalks and in the parking lots around that area where it occurred. And I turned around and I looked at the cars, and as anybody would, I noticed the people who were driving, and I noticed the scenario, and then I started looking at the people around, and I noticed that not one person that I could see was actually on a cell phone. And so I began to wonder if anybody had even called this in 60 seconds after it happened. Everybody was just kind of standing around. And do you know, within the 10 minutes that it took for the fire truck to arrive, who were the first responders on that scene, not one person went up to those two actually young women who were the drivers in the two different cars. Not one person went up to them and asked them, "Are you okay?" Or put an arm around them to comfort them, or told them, "Yes, I called 911." I did call 911, but I also did not, and I'm actually ashamed to say it, and I've been wondering about this in myself. I didn't go up to them and approach them. And I just feel like this, our capacity to be passive bystanders instead of engaged witnesses. And Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman, in their book, Towards Psychologies of Liberation, again, I mentioned this last week, they discuss this a lot, and they talk about how witnessing actually involves you allowing your heart to be touched by something. And as unhappy as I'm sure everybody was about this accident and probably traumatized, I think that a lot of us fell right into that role of being passive bystanders, where I don't want to say people were entertained by this, but a lot of people were just standing around waiting to see what would happen. And, in our culture, it's rampant. I mean, we have all kinds of shows. I don't know if you've seen this new show on CNN lately. I don't like it because I think CNN's supposed to give you news, and they've just started this new show that's called What Would You Do, I think is what it's called. I don't know how many of you have seen that, but it's, it's basically setting up situations and then checking to see what the bystanders who think something real is going on are going to do. Are they going to get involved or aren't they? I mean, maybe it's a wake-up call for us all to really start to wonder, are we seeing the people around us that are having these kinds of challenges? And like you said, Michael, nobody wants to get involved, even when these people have a history of violence or psychotic episodes or mental illness of some sort. We don't want to get involved, and it's too easy for us to turn the other way in order to, to protect ourselves, because we don't want to be involved, because, we prefer to detach or dissociate because it could cause problems for us, because the emotions are too much for us to look at. But until we begin to start looking at these people and engaging with them, this is not going to change. And, I mean, in shamanic cultures, the villages had a habit of taking the people that had issues like hearing voices or being seriously ill and really surrounding them, putting them in the center of the village in a place where they could be tended and cared for, and surrounding them and showing their support and allowing them to move through in whatever way they could with full support through what was going on with them, and hopefully, sometimes often, out the other side where they could actually come back from whatever had happened to them and be accepted and even bring back, it's an initiation, bring back gifts for the community. Some of these people who were hearing voices actually ended up coming out of this thing on the other side and becoming the shaman of the village at a later point. So, I think all of this to say, and I apologize, I've been kind of running on. I know a couple of you have your hands up, and I really want to open this up to everybody, and let's just have, let's hear some of your questions.
No, what you said is very, very important. And let me add one little note to that, what you said in terms of the next step in witnessing. My wife wrote a beautiful piece recently. She did a Christmas piece called Emmanuel 2 years ago, and she wrote it right after her son enlisted in the Army. Okay? That's a backdrop to the real story. Anyway, she wrote the Mary monologues. And if any of you want, write to the office. We'll try to get you a copy of the Mary monologue that she wrote. Anyway, long story short, here's Mary coming on stage, and she basically talks to God saying, this is my child, this is my boy. I don't care for a savior. I don't want are you looking at my son with spears being thrown into him, with the being nailed to a cross? This is my flesh and blood. This is my child. And this is partly why, excuse me, Bonnie, I said to you last week, I do think part of the healing's got to come from the feminine right now. We didn't have enough time last week to talk about it, but we are really acknowledging that, and that piece really opened my eyes up, that if you can imagine, put some of the politicians in the role of some of these parents are in right now down in Sandy Hook, there's going to be changes in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. Okay, we got hands up. I don't know how to respond to that. You know how to do it, Bonnie?
Yeah, I can take care of that. I just wanted to say, Martin Luther King, he said that a riot, which I consider is a symptom, right, of something that's going on, is the language of the unheard. And of course, again, I mean, the politicians, among others, among most of us, again, it's really ingrained in our culture, is not to pay attention, to listen and to witness. And of course, James Hillman said that the eye and the wound are the same. And what he meant by that was, if you just stand back and watch something passively and you don't get engaged, you could be doing as much damage to the person who's been wounded as the original wound was. And I think that's the opportunity for all of us to get involved and to change something about ourselves. I mean, we can't change maybe in a moment the entire public, but that is something that we can change. Let's go to some hands. This first person, you've had your hand up for a long time, and you are, I just took you away from that. You're listed as anonymous, and so I don't even know where you're calling from. Would you just put your hand back up again, and I'll grab you in just a second. Meanwhile, let's go to someone from Fort Madison, Indiana. Go ahead. Can you speak?
I think you mean Fort Madison, Iowa.
Oh, could be. Sorry.
Yes, this is Marie. I did have a question. Bonnie, you mentioned the problem of evil, obviously, the situation. A number of years ago, I did research with a now-deceased FBI agent, Ted Gunderson, who had researched, leading up to the Columbine murders, a series of events and patterns in regard to research that he was doing with a retired major. It's an old book, if you're looking for books, called Pawns in the Game, but it would help explain the increased frequency in the pattern of these violent events, and also the regrettable outcome that's likely with the escalation and the increase in persons buying guns in response. So you might want to look at that book, Pawns in the Game. It's an old game. It's an old one from the 70s. Or even, I think Ted Gunderson's website is still up, even though he passed away about a year or so ago. But his early research on the nature of these sorts of escalating manipulation of individuals who are have emotional problems that can be easily manipulated, that are traumatized themselves, from a law enforcement perspective, if you have any thought about that.
Well, thank you. I think that's a great recommendation, and I certainly think that anything that we can do to be able to look further at patterns, again, that's Michael's core work, and it's been such a huge contribution to the field of depth psychology. Anything that we can do to look at, that will help us to establish and understand the patterns that are going on, and as you say, the increases and the increase in frequency in these violent kinds of events is really important. Michael,
also, the timing in relationship to Christmas.
Marie, look, and also Marie's written a wonderful book on the whole process of mass violent mass events like this, soccer and all that, mass riots on campus. She's done a wonderful piece of work on this. Excuse me. When we get to talking about legal and police issues and all that, what it's saying is the natural inhibitions are not holding. I mean, you have a police system there when the natural systems are not holding to do what they should do, right? Now, I remember in Vermont they started a campaign a number of years ago. I mean, it's much more mild an issue, but anyway, it makes to the point, about seatbelts. They say, click it or get a ticket. Click it or get a ticket. And I tell you know what? So what they're gonna play to is people's desire not to lose money. Why not talk about people about losing lives? Is that really going to hold? Is that it's all about punitive as opposed to educative? And it always bothered me. Okay, so you get a $20 ticket. But what if you say to somebody, you could be saving somebody's life, your own, and maybe somebody in another car with this issue? But again, I think, look, it was Freud and Jung. You really got to go to a big issue with what you're asking, Marie. And a long story short, you go into the issue of innate moral systems, which is actually the topic of my next book, which is Transgressions of Innate Moral Codes. And, the debate between Freud and Jung was always that, what's the origins of morality? And Freud believed it was external, and Jung said, well, it had to come from somewhere, like the chicken and the egg thing. It had to come from somewhere first. So if you look at the police systems and legal systems and all that, you say it's externally driven. And it's externally driven and enforced because the innate codes are no longer holding. And as Bonnie's saying, I think really well, is the fact that they're not holding is a story for us to look at. Mm-hmm. That's where we got to go with this. In the interim, yes, we do everything we can. If you got to have guards at the school, maybe you got to do it. If they want to talk about arming principals, I mean, do I like it? No, but you know what? You hate to say it, but maybe who knows? Maybe if the principal was armed, maybe it could have stopped it. I don't have those answers, but I think it's good that we do look at some of these pragmatic pieces. We have to.
We have to be open-minded. Yeah.
You got to be open-minded.
If we have all the answers before we ever start the discussion, then that doesn't solve anything. So absolutely.
No. So thank you for that, Marie. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, let's go back to this person. I think you must be calling from Skype, and that's why you're listed as anonymous. But go ahead. You should be able to talk now.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Hi.
Hi. I know you are primarily talking about the Sandy tragedy, but I know a lot of us are dealing with a lot of grief and loss during this holiday period. And I lost my precious mother recently, and someone else very close to me. And I was just wondering how Dr. Michael suggests that you deal with loss and grief in general during this period.
That's a great question. Tell us your name, too, would you please? Would you mind?
Levon.
Levon, thank you. Michael, I know a lot of us are dealing with these kinds of things, and often a holiday or an event like Christmas can even make it more poignant, as if it weren't already. So do you have some thoughts or ideas on how
there's a whole terminology in psychoanalytic traditions called the blue holiday, the blue syndrome, which is during holidays people get very depressed and morose and sad and all that. Well, you know what? In many ways, if one doesn't have... Let me grab the other phone. Hold on a second. I think the people that do have a sense of sadness over the Christmas holidays and all that, they're much more aligned with the origins of the holiday. It's not an anomaly. It's not their own sadness. They're related to the fact that here you have a holiday where all of the Jewish children over a certain age were going to be slaughtered. That's not something to celebrate. But what we do, again, it's another wonderful example of what we do as a culture, is we look at, it's Christmas, it's a joy, it's the birth of the new life, the birth of the Savior. Of course, and thank you for that. We thank God for that, right? But it's also a time when how many kids were slaughtered? It's another story where all the slaughter was there. And again, as I said last week, it's a time for us to have to hold on both shoulders the sadness. I mean, look, losing a loved one, it's never easy. I lost a mentor 3 years ago, the man that was the most important person in my life. He was not my family, but he had the most important role in my life in so many ways. I'll never, ever stop the mourning for that. It'll be with me forever.
Yeah.
It's got to be carried.
Thank you for sharing with us, and I'm so sorry for your loss. I know it's really hard, and I think what occurs to me is to come back to that reflection process and allowing ourselves. We haven't really talked a lot about mourning and grieving in this particular series of teleseminars, and again, there's just hasn't been time to sort of cover everything that has occurred to us, and we've focused a lot on other things. But there's something about the mourning and grieving process that also is collectively not addressed properly, I think, in our culture. Somebody made the comment about last week how we had a few moments of silence to honor the victims who had been lost. And somebody, wrote a post about that, a very, nice, well-thought-out post, and they said, boy, I didn't want the silence. I wanted to hear people wailing and grieving and screaming and, really feeling what it was that had actually gone on. And, whether you choose to grieve one way or the other, the fact is I think we have to allow ourselves to be in that mourning process. And, frankly, our culture doesn't allow that. People give you a week or two, and then they tell you to snap out of it or to distract yourself with other things or to go on and do other things. But there are so many ways that we can allow ourselves to sink into that. Write poetry, read poetry, just sit and do absolutely nothing. Cry your eyes out. Read memoirs from that person that you've lost, or just sit and think about them. Everybody will have different ways of doing it, but I think it's just really important that we actually allow ourselves to be in that and don't let anybody take that process of mourning and grieving away from us. All right, let's go on to someone from Indianapolis, Indiana. The last name is George. Can you just say your name for us?
Yes, I'm Barbara George, and I'm in Indianapolis, and thank you guys. Bonnie, one thing on you, your presentation is wonderful, but I've had a different experience in the last 10 years or so, and I found a lot of programs and a lot of support saying where you haven't found them. So I think there's a lot of things that are being done out there, and I think we need to talk about what's being done as well as what is missing, because otherwise we're giving a whole lot of energy to what we don't see there. But there's a lot of things that are there that maybe we're not seeing. And maybe if we open our eyes to look for what is being done out there, we might be able to change the whole energy of the field. So there's that aspect. I read The Gift of Fear, at least picked it up again, by Gavin de Becker. Michael, he has a history of working in the criminal area, and it's wonderful because it's survival signals, and he's a pattern recognizer. So I think his work is very appropriate for this discussion, and he cites a lot of case examples. It's a wonderful book. There's also another book that I read before any of this happened. It's called What It Is Like to Go to War by Carl Marlantes, who was interviewed by Bill Moyers. And he speaks from an ex-Vietnam vet in what it's like to kill people, and coming out of a candidness that's unbelievable. I would hope that maybe, I'm going to send you a copy, Michael, and perhaps you could get him involved with the program, because he's just a brilliant guy, and he's just opened up a conversation if we support him and support that book around. One of the guys from, representative from the Cleveland area or the Northeast Ohio area, has written a book called Mindful Nation, and that supports, Bonnie, what you were talking about paying attention, having attention, talking about these things, but attending to our attention skills and engaging in that aspect, because if we're more aware of when we're being possessed, we might have more management of what we do. Mm-hmm. And I think it's not just you and I think it's everyone. So, and then also Stephen Levine's book on unattended sorrow really goes into grief and our fear of death and our lack of discussion around death and dying in our culture, but also all the grief that we're holding on so many levels. It's a wonderful thing that I just kind of picked up because I was going to send it to somebody. I had to reread it, and it's like, wow, it seems like it's in tune with everything we're talking about. So thank you guys so much for having this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. In terms of what Barbara's bringing to the table, one of the things I've heard that is one of the most creative in a long time, and this is brought to my attention by Mary Jo LaFleur, a pattern analyst in the Portland area. There are a number of really great analysts out there. Shannon's there, Diane, and some others. Anyway, she told me that in history, what was done, and it's now being done again, that when the warriors would come back from battle, the tribe would not let them back into the tribe, per se. They wouldn't let them come back to the communal tribe. They had to go to separate buildings, away, isolated from everybody. And what they were doing was like a decompression lab, They went away and they were so brilliant. And Bob said it nicely when she said about changing the field. Or trying to heal the field. What the elders of the tribe knew was that when a warrior comes back from war, they're still a warrior. They're in a warrior mode. And they knew that if they bring that warrior who's in warrior mode back into the tribe, they're going to be ready to fight and be violent and aggressive because they're still in, to use our language, they're in the archetypal field of war, in battle. If you're in the field of battle and war, you're going to fight anybody who's near you. Anything is going to be seen as a threat to your existence because everything from the reptilian to the highest level of your brain is going to be activated in your psyche. So they sent him away for months. Now, I found out from a colleague that they're doing the same thing, that the Army is picking this up again, where they're beginning to have these decompression-type environments set up for soldiers coming back from war. Because they know, and again, I think our language would be so helpful, our understanding of these patterns would be so helpful to U.S. governmental agencies or anyone dealing with warfare, is that what you're looking to do is change the phenomena. Now, you're not going to change the field of war, but you're changing at that moment. Here's the key, Barb. You're changing the individual's alignment to it. And one other very small study, and I want to cite, it's actually somebody who may be on the phone tonight, Roberto Palacio, who told me this. He was a former ambassador for Venezuela, a lovely, lovely man. He told me the story that in the Middle East for many years, there was, between these two borders, there was like 90% fatalities of border guards. And somebody came up with this idea of putting name tags on the border guards. Hi, I'm Bonnie, and I'm married, and I have my family, and here's where I live, and blah, blah, blah. Hi, I'm Michael, I'm married, blah, blah. Here's what and you know where they went from like 90% fatalities down to like 5%? You know why? Because they broke the field. They broke your life. Look, what is it that subsidizes the power of a field but ongoing iterations? When you're in that field, you're not going to stop. You're loading the bullets. You're ducking for cover. You are in that field. If something allows you to break the cycling, now this is the other part of it, and this is where a lot of the work at the CC Institute's coming in, looking at how you interrupt the cycle of a pattern. But it takes the ability to know something about that pattern. And you have to have the courage to say, look, this is going. I mean, I'm sure all of you have been in situations before in your life when you saw somebody gearing up and they're getting ready to punch the wall out or something, or worse. Or on the other side, somebody who's gearing up from doing the most incredible act of benevolence you've ever seen. You see it coming. You know, be a weather forecaster, but you can't be a faint of heart with this. You know, Bonnie, you mentioned that horrible thing that it was in New York State what happened about the firefighters. You know who did it? You know who the murderer was? He was a guy convicted of manslaughter. He killed his mother.
Yeah, grandmother, yeah.
His grandmother. He killed his grandmother. He shot her. Now, excuse me, what's he doing out? Now, I know it's a big story, but the issue is we have to take seriously pattern, because, look, and here's a long story short, and Barb is addressing it with our comments. A pattern, the more deeply involved you are in a pattern, it means the more you're possessed by that pattern. The more you're possessed by a pattern, it means you are becoming identified with that archetype, and the archetype is blowing through you like a window with shredded glass, and the hail and the snow and the wind blows through. Because the ego ain't there at those times of possession. And that's why what these brilliant native elders understood was we have to interrupt the cycle. We're going to take you away. Maybe you take a bath a couple times a day, you go hunting, and you go fishing, and you sleep, and you nap, and maybe after a month of this you realize there's nobody threatening you, nobody coming after you. But that's the wisdom of this. That's the wisdom. So it's a great thing you bring it up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent. This whole idea of being able to change a pattern, sometimes we don't know how, but if we know that it can be done, and of course we do know that, then we can begin there. Thank you. I think, Michael, I'm noticing the time. We do have another hand up. Why don't we take one last question?
Yeah, that's fine. We have a little extra time. We can do it.
Okay. All right, so this is from someone named, it's listed at least as Lawrence. Hi, you're on from Hopewell, New Jersey. Can you say your name?
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Oh, yes, wonderful. My name is Julia, and I do live in New Jersey. Thank you for taking my call. I'm probably the last one speaking. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for opening up this conversation. It's been a very difficult 2 weeks for me, and I've been really grieving a lot the loss of these children. And I'm a mother, and I'm a psychiatrist. I work in women's trauma programs, so I deal with trauma patients a lot. And what comes to mind is that we live, I might be speaking too exaggerating and too rough, but it feels to me that we're living in such a sick society that it's kind of natural that the Sandy Hook is happening. I would be very surprised if it doesn't, because we have adopted such an anti-nature, anti-human attitude and beliefs, and the values of the society is just so anti-human, anti-natural, sort of. We're not allowed to, we're power-driven, we're not allowed to rest, we're not allowed to love, we're not allowed to grieve, and everything seems to be, sort of natural way of life is not possible. So what I'm trying to say is that in the Sandy Hook tragedy, I was wondering if you also observe a certain symbolism behind it, that this terrible imbalance of the forces, unconscious forces that operate in us in a collective level, is this immature kind of masculine that is vacillating between the hero and the villain, and he goes on and he massacres the feminine principle, basically the mothering, the child, the care, and this kind of stuff. So it's been brewing in me, and I'm not sure how to formulate it quite yet, but I have a very strong feeling that there's a certain symbolic meaning behind this event, that if we do look at it closely, we might be able to see it as some sort of a revelation that would allow us to sort of understand the forces that operate in this current time. Thank you very much. If you have any comments.
That's a great question. Bonnie, anything you want to say first about it?
Well, yeah, thank you, Julia. I mean, that was really beautifully stated, and I think a lot of us can easily fall into some despair just because we know at some, core part of us that what you're talking about is very real, that we have become so disconnected, and not only from each other, but also from our own feelings, emotions, and our capacity to be connected again. last week somebody had written in the question, and we didn't get to it, but it was something I had been doing some thinking about, and so I was interested that another person was also thinking from that depth aspect. They were asking, what do you think the significance of the word Sandy is? Because we just had the devastating Hurricane Sandy, and then, Sandy Hook Elementary. And I had initially, that was one of the first things that I started looking at, and what sort of was coming to me in that analysis was that it was really, sand is the ultimate fragmentation. I mean, it's all these millions and billions of bits and pieces that are not necessarily interconnected. And of course, Jung talked about schizophrenia and how the complexes make us, the complexes have become disconnected and become these autonomous fragments. This is the possession that Michael's talking about. They start to take on a life of their own, and we don't even see how we're connected to it, or we've forgotten a long time ago, how that part of us that we can no longer own, that is really running us, has really taken over. And they don't reintegrate back into the psychic totality unless something is done to, some kind of a pattern interrupt is done. And so I think this fragmentation that you're referring to, Julia, this lack of connection, this, the fact that we all came from the same place at one point in time, that we are all connected at every moment is just something that we have lost complete access to. And the only way that we're going to be able to come back to that is to be able to start paying attention again, this consciousness around it. So thank you. I think that's really important.
No, it's a great thing. And one thing we can say is that I think probably 100% of these shootings are done by men.
Right.
That's a pretty striking observation. I mean, that's not prejudicial. That's not conjecture. It's factual.
Yeah.
And, if we want to make it some kind of Oedipal drama, I mean, that becomes much more speculative. But there's clearly something that the male psyche is working with around the aggressions. I mean, I think we had the Amazons early on, the Amazonian hunters that were the brilliant, powerful hunters and aggressions and all that. And that energy went underground for a long time, and then the men took on the energy, and they became much more destructive. And again, I hate to say it as a male. I said last week, I was embarrassed watching the last presidential debate that were going on. I was absolutely, I thought, you two morons. you primitive men, and how despicable. So I think we can say, and I share Bonnie's affection for your question. It's a brilliant question. That I think we do need to ask, by looking at the pattern. You see, what you do when you read a pattern is you look at what's given, what's there. You don't read a pattern by doing the via negativa, by what's not there initially. You say, what's there? Well, number one, it's a masculine. It's a masculine with these big rifles and guns and things, and they're doing mass killings. And many of them, it's not specific. They're not always specific targets. The one with Gifford in Tucson 2 years ago, last year, it wasn't necessarily specific. When they go into the movie houses, they're not always specific. There's something there. So I think what we can say is there's some expression of male aggression, violence that's just so out of control. Now, the other thing I would add to this discussion is, whatever this force is, I think, Bonnie, you got to this earlier in one of your comments. Whatever this force is in the human psyche that is overflowing the bounds right now, it's gone to such an extent that, yes, we had Herod back then doing it to children. Now, and I think why this one is hit so deeply and why many of us are mourning with this, these are, I mean, I always want to use street language. I'm not going to do it here. But to say these are children. How dare this thing, this viral, this cancer, go to these innocent children at 5 and 6 and 7 years old? It's gone too far. This is, I think, why we are so shaken by this, to say no one's immune from this. You hate your ex-husband, you hate your ex-wife, you hate this, and you say, well, I can understand a little bit why they shot them. They shot, in Brattleboro, Vermont, a town of 12,000 people, there's been a couple of killings here in the past 3 years. Well, there's always some, whether it's a vendetta or whatever, you can say, well, I can understand a little bit some of the motives. There's no real motive here. But when we then say, okay, we have something with the masculine, something with guns, something with these rifles, and then they're going after the innocents, and they're going after the helpless ones. And then, I want to bring in Dr. Robert Lang's work I mentioned last week, because he has made a real contribution to this. And our caller right here, I would think you may enjoy this book. Enjoy is the wrong word, but get something out of it. It's called Beyond Yahweh. by Robert Langs, Beyond Yahweh, and he talks about the whole predator-prey relationship and how that's been worked over in the psyche or not worked over. And his big thing is, when we feel that we may be prey, we become the predator very quickly.
Yeah.
And what happens is we then resort to a reptilian attack mode to avoid it. And there are many, many things one does. And that's why, again, I think where these talks hopefully can be helpful, I mean, again, I love the question, is from an archetypal perspective, say there's some archetypal force that is just running through these broken windows that's affecting us, that's determining our behavior. And it's gone too far. And you hate to say this, I hate to say this, but what it's going to finally take is it's got to take some high-ranking people that experience the horror that these families are going through right now.
Yeah.
If this happened, and I'm not wishing this to anybody, okay, I'm really not. If somebody like Barack Obama's children were threatened or shot, or some high-ranking person, there would be not only gun legislation in the morning before you woke up, but there would be more psychiatric care. One of the callers called in last week asking about more care. There would be a lot more care. There would be a lot more work on early detection. There'd be a lot of stuff. We'd be getting calls, I bet you, as pattern analysts, we'd be getting calls left and right to do this work. But right now, Sandy Hook, small town in Connecticut. It's still not enough.
I hope it doesn't have to come to that, Michael. And yet, again, there's so much truth to what you're saying that is very worrisome. And I think your point about the masculine is really interesting. Obviously, we're not saying it's only men and only women, but we're looking at more of a masculine way of doing things, the aggression that you mentioned, or a feminine way of doing things. And of course, on the feminine side, there's something called compassion, which most of us have heard of, and hopefully, we all possess and are able to tap into. But I do think that our capacity in our culture to objectify, to be the subject of everything and look at everybody else and everything else as objects that don't have, the same feelings or the same emotions or the same needs or the same goals or whatever it is that we have. It's a very masculine way of being. Objectify an object, it's like you're aiming at a target. You're doing something to an object. And so this whole idea of objectification makes it easier and easier for people to turn off their feelings and to regard other human beings as actually humans. And, we're living in a culture where we're all just constantly having to be on guard about, how we're going to be objectified next. And it's really interesting because there was a mention, more than a mention, that apparently the shooter, Adam Lanza, in this particular case of the Sandy Hook shooting, had autism or was diagnosed with autism on one part of the scale. And, there was a quote from Michael Fordham, who's quite a well-known psychoanalyst. Some of you may be familiar with him. And he actually did some work on autism and suggested that autism could be a sort of second skin that creates a barrier between a child and his environment. And I don't know if that's true or not, but, the fact that we are all just continuing to find ways to protect ourselves increasingly, in a place where there needs to be more feeling and more caring, I think is very telling as well.
Well, let me, as I begin to wrap up from my side, and I think it's really relevant right now to the last wonderful question, is we're planning to do a seminar series on this whole theme of trauma, and we want to invite Bessel van der Kolk, Ruth Linus, and a lot of the major pioneers in the field to be part of this. And we're in the process of arranging this right now, and we'll keep you posted on that one. And the other one is I want to really invite all of you to join us in Italy this year. This is not a sales pitch. It's frame it any way you want to. But I had a hunch about 4 months ago, and actually changed the title of the new book that's going out for me now to When the Gods Are Silent. When the Gods Are Silent, and that's the theme for this year's Italy's conference. When the Gods Are Silent, awakening from illness and trauma to healing and meaning. And the faculty is incredible. We've got, I don't think I told you this, Bonnie, Rick Tarnas is coming. He's going to be there. Yep. Alan Guggenbuhl is going to be there from Switzerland. A woman named Bonnie Zello, who's been involved in the sexual slave trade for many years. A woman... Barbara Thompson is going to be there from Russell Sage College in Troy, who's doing a lot of wonderful work on the expressive arts and trauma. Laura Lee is bringing some of her dances, and Laura Lee is going to be giving a presentation as well. I'll be teaching, and it's one of the most sacred places in the world. Regardless of your religious orientation, it's a spiritual place. So it cuts across religious disciplines and. But do think about it.
I can vouch for that. Michael, I've been there several times in the past few years, and it really is a beautiful, wonderful conference. And actually, the benefit I've seen from all of that has just been the community. I mean, you always have amazing speakers and amazing themes, and, there's not much more you can say about that, but really the community that seems to be attracted to that particular conference has always been just beautiful. So I just thank you for, what you've done to bring that together. I will just say myself in closing, I know there's a lot more of you that have your hands up, and I'm so sorry we just don't have the time to get to you. This warrants so much more time and conversation. I hope that you'll go to depthpsychologyalliance.com and log on and just join the conversation there. Bring your questions, bring your discussion. This is really important to continue, and of course looking forward to the teleseminar series that Michael just mentioned. And then also go on depthpsychologylist.com and read some of the blogs that are there. That's a fairly new site, and it's meant to really bring depth psychology out in the world to attract people who've never heard of depth psychology or who are interested in getting some kind of therapy to show up there. And so a lot of the blog posts there are meant to really be educational on the basics of depth psychology, and there's some really great stuff that's showing up there as well. So Michael, thank you so much for making the time. I know you've been sick, and that's very meaningful that you're willing to spend your evening with us and share your wisdom. And thank you again to all of our participants. You guys, you're taking time out of your own lives to be part of something that's really important. So really appreciate all of that from you as well.
And Bonnie, thank you a million for you and bringing so many members of your community to the table for this.
My pleasure.
So thank you. So please, everybody, write to us if we do our best to respond any way we can. Stay involved in the respective. The two communities are really joined, depth psychology and the CC. Excuse me. And I hope that we've opened the discussion. We've provided somewhat of a template to begin to understand the unimaginables. Okay. And as I told the story last week, when that man said to me, Michael, don't ever say that we can never understand the Holocaust. He said, because the minute we stop even trying to understand, we open the door for repetition. And that story will be with me for the rest of my life. And so, look, I hope we all continue our work, and maybe we can arrange, if there's a lot of interest, maybe another couple of sessions on this theme that we can have for more questions. But I think Bonnie and I both felt we had a few things we wanted to say tonight, so it wasn't going to be only questions of people. We had a few pieces put on the table. So I want to thank everybody and say good night. And again, we have probably 8 different countries represented. It's a wonderful grouping of people, and from all walks of life. We've had some colleagues that you met last year from the Canadian Yukon that are part of this thing, So everybody, thank you. Thank you so much.
Carry this forward and make sure that you're writing about it, talking about it, dialoguing about it, and let's just keep this going. And that's how we can all continue to witness it. And thank you so much.
Okay, good night, everybody. Thank you, Bonnie.
Good night.
Right.
Thanks,
good
everyone.
Night. Bye-bye.
The moderator has left the conference.